Good morning, everyone. I wish I could be with you. I miss you all. But you'll know that I'm isolating because we had a lateral flow test come back positive on Wednesday. So I hope to see you soon. There's a new film just been released on Netflix in the last month or so called Don't Look Up. And it's a satire on the apathy of governments to the huge crises that the world faces. It's kind of a comedy drama. There are two low-level astronomers played by Jennifer Lawrence and Leonardo DiCaprio, and they work out that the world has just over 6 months before a huge comet strikes the planet and causes an extinction event. It couldn't be more serious. And so they're taken to the White House and to warn the president, to get the news to the president as quickly as possible. But the president, played by Meryl Streep, responds with disinterest and even more apathy about the possible destruction of the planet Earth. And they stand as scientific prophets, if you like, to a coming disaster coming out of the sky. And they want the world to wake up and act. Amos, in the 8th century BC, was a prophet sent by God who stood at a similar vantage point. He didn't see a comet heading towards the people of the world, but he saw just judgment was on its way. The Lord gave him a series of visions promising that the injustices visited upon the poor and the exploited by the arrogant, by the manipulative and indulgent rich would be dealt with. And that atrocities carried out by the surrounding nations against God's people would provoke a reckoning by the Lord. When the dust finally would settle at the end of Amos's prophecy and the case would be closed against the nations, restoration would begin, rebuilding would start, and blessing would begin to flow. So this new series, I hope will resensitize us to the justice of God for those who are crushed and treated appallingly. Amos is a classic prophet in that he has 20/20 spiritual vision to see what's going on in society. God's people in the 8th century BC were divided into two kingdoms. After Solomon, the one nation of Israel split into the north, which confusingly was called Israel, and had 10 tribes in it. And at this point, the capital was in Samaria, a town called Samaria. And in the south, the remaining two tribes were known as Judah, and their capital was in Jerusalem. And they still had the mandate for worship. In the north, they'd set up two bogus temples with corrupted worship, distorted worship. But in the south, Jerusalem was still God's place where people were called to come and sacrifice and worship him. Amos is distinct in his background personally. He's from a place called Tekoa, which was a rural village south of Bethlehem and Jerusalem, down in Judah. And what's interesting about Amos is he's not an establishment figure. He's not from the center of power or the center of religion. He's from a rural setting. He's a simple man, and it stands in stark contrast, like a critique against the indulgence and luxury and opulence and self-service of those in power and those with money. He earned his living as a shepherd, or he also worked tending fig trees. The name that he's given, the description of his job in the Hebrew, means he also probably dealt, and he was a dealer of animals. He looked after flocks. He bred animals. There's cattle involved. So he's a man who's familiar with husbandry and farming. But he's certainly not from Jerusalem, and he's not from Samaria. He's an outsider looking in. We're called to be distinct, and Amos was geographically distinct. He was distinct in terms of class, but he was also distinct in terms of his devotion to the Lord. And maybe that's going to be something we reflect upon as we go through Amos 2. How distinct are we? Or maybe it will challenge us to think of how money or luxury or hedonism have caught our eye. And we've taken our eye off an earlier devotion we had to the Lord. The times of Amos, the chronological context is really interesting in that he comes towards the end of a long time of stability, long time of prosperity. Both northern and southern kings, Uzziah in the south and Jeroboam II in the north, had very long reigns, at least 40 years each. And his prophecy comes towards the end of their reign. So both nations have known long periods of stability, and both have flourished in that time. But the downside of it is that, especially in the north, the people of God had drifted. They were self-made in north and south, and there's a danger of being self-made in that you believe it, that there's a delusion that you pulled yourself up by your bootstraps and pride quickly follows. And then God can become an optional extra. He can become a fringe figure in your life as you enjoy life's great party. And that's what's happened in the nation of Israel, particularly the northern kingdom. There's a spiritual malaise set in, and people, as we'll see, have diluted and wandered, drifted from their faith. And at that point, enter Amos. Amos begins with a signal. Into the long flourishing decades of Uzziah and Jeroboam II, an earthquake is coming. Amos saw in verse 1, and that's an unusual word for seeing. It means to see and understand. And he perceived what God was about to do. He didn't just hear it, he understood what God was about to do. And the earthquake did come, and the archaeological record proves it. Even just a few months ago in Jerusalem, they found the layer, the earthquake layer from this event. And it was an enormously powerful, it was between 7 and 8 on the Richter scale. The largest and most powerful earthquake in the last 4,000 years in that region. And so 2 years after Amos began to speak, the earthquake came. And that resonates with the Lord roaring from Zion in verse 1. The tone of Amos's message will be withering for many people. The luxuriously green ridge that is Mount Carmel would dry up. And that sets the tone for much of Amos's prophecy. The Lord is roaring. There's going to be a withering and a drying up of what is rich and fertile. And an earthquake, huge upheaval, literally, but also spiritually and nationally, is coming. And at this point, I want to just flag up that this is where we can slip into a caricature of God. As you read through this passage, or you've heard it this morning, sometimes we can have a knee-jerk reaction. This is the quick-tempered, the angry-faced God of street-level stereotype. You know, the Old Testament God's angry and judgmental, the New Testament God's loving and kind. We need to disabuse ourselves of that distortion. Our enemy, our spiritual enemy, has done an incredibly effective job. And maybe I'm speaking to someone this morning who he's done a job of turning many people away from Scripture because they're deeply uncomfortable with a God who judges. And they're lost to reading their Bibles. They struggle to engage because of books like Amos. I want to call you back again, and I want to call you to look deeper and think harder, explore, get under the skin and ask questions about what really is going on here. Who is God? What is he like in these books and these when judgment comes? What happens next is that God's judgment comes upon the nations that surround the people of God. Now, this isn't God going after someone who's stolen an apple because they're starving hungry, or being angry because someone got up late and didn't pray. Or, this isn't God going after the run-of-the-mill, the daily struggles and failings we have. He's way more patient and merciful than that. We're going to touch upon each of the judgments in each nation, and you'll see what I mean. This isn't God who is quick to jump on every small foible and failing. One commentator said he sees Amos like a hawk circling the nations in an ever-tightening circle. And he begins in Damascus, furthest away in the far north, the capital of a country called Syria. And the judgment coming upon them is because they threshed people, they massacred people as if they were pulling them over a threshing sledge, which is a metal-toothed sledge. And it's an image of people, of bodies being torn and killed. It's an appalling image. And it's an image of people being brutally killed by the people of Syria and Damascus. And in Gaza, the capital of the Philistines, over in the west by the sea, it says they captured whole communities and sold them as slaves to the Edomites. There's an extreme callousness and opportunism here. There's no filter for the weak or vulnerable to escape. Babies, children, young and old were all sold into lifelong slavery by the Philistines. People of Tyre, immediately to the north, they were turning people into money as well. War crimes against the weak and the strong. This is made worse because Tyre had a treaty of brotherhood. Historically, with King Hiram, they came into an allegiance with Israel. So Israel was looking for an ally and found a betrayer. And then Edom, over on the other side of the Jordan, again, the descendants of Ishmael, descendants of Esau, and they're brothers to Israel, and yet now they're brutal murderers. There's ice in their veins. It said they stifled all compassion. And because their fury flamed unchecked against the people of God, fire will consume their fortresses and their cities. And then Ammon to the northeast, the Ammonites. There's a terrible savagery going on here. It's hard to read. They ripped open the pregnant women of Gilead. There's a genocidal route. They wanted to expand their kingdom and would kill mothers and children, the future generations, to wipe out the people of God. And then Moab, east of the Dead Sea. This is strange. They burned the bones of a king. That doesn't seem that important to us. But in an honor-shame culture of those days, this would ignite war for generations. To desecrate the bones of a king would mean that generations to come, there would be a constant hatred and battling. So in doing that, they're setting off multi-generational bloodshed. Question, when did the Crusades end? Well, you might think they ended in the Middle Ages. Well, Muslim scholar Suleiman A. Murad writes, we invoke the Crusades because we want to believe that the past determines the present, that these are but different chapters in the same ongoing conflict, and that many people are adamant that old scores must be settled. For some people, the Crusades are still fresh, 600 years later. And that's, I think, part of what's going on here. You burn our king's bones, we're going to kill you for the next 100 years. Each of these countries carried out appalling and deeply destructive sin against the people of God and against their neighbours. And Amos pronounced the sort of justice that has the victims dancing in the street and jumping on the statues of toppled tyrants who ordered this savagery. This is good justice against terrible crimes. The sort of justice that we long for. It's the end to the sort of crimes that we pray God would do something about. And here he is doing that very thing. If God wasn't angry about these things, what would he be angry about? There's no moral maze here. There's no ethical blur. I think some of us need to be resensitized to the righteousness and justice of the Lord. Not distorted that he's angry and quick-tempered, but that actually there is a rightness about justice in the face of these events. The Rohingyas, Muslims, have been massacred and driven into exile. The Uyghurs are in concentration camps in China. There's honour killings of young women. Down syndrome babies are disappearing in the West because they're seen as unworthy of life. Richard Dawkins wrote, it would be immoral to bring a Down syndrome unborn fetus into the world if you have the choice. The sweatshops of Cambodia, Thailand, India and Leicester making fast fashion. You know, people living well on the sweat and tears of the poor. Spending time with Amos, we're going to get a vision of a patient God who's slow to anger, but who here his patience has finally worn thin and run out. I can't help have us examine ourselves in the, until very recently, stable and prosperous country that we live in. Are we distinct in our society, or have we drifted and become cosseted and in love and seduced by luxury and indulgence? Amos might have something to say in calling us back to God. But be encouraged if you feel that here is a voice, someone speaking about the goodness of God, who cares about the poor, cares about the ill-treated, cares about war crimes and atrocities. Be encouraged, because that's who, that's who we meet here. Amos's vantage point was from the outside, and it's okay to be on the outside. Sometimes that's the prophetic standpoint. What has Amos revealed to you? What do you see and hear along with him in these opening visions and words?